Drink up, you peasant. The woman in red laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a performance. A laugh meant to echo, meant to sting, meant to brand the black woman beneath her hand as something less than the marble floors they stood on. Phones lifted. Lenses caught it. The crowd leaned in not to help, but to watch. That's what a gala does. It transforms cruelty into entertainment. The black CEO didn't flinch. One hand remained steady on her phone, pressed to her ear as if she hadn't just been baptized in humiliation. She whispered into the receiver, calm and deliberate. Proceed with the review. The insult had landed. The laughter spread like wildfire across the tables, men in tuxedos chuckling, women in sequined gowns covering their mouths as if the shame belonged to her. A server froze in the corner, silver tray trembling in his grip, eyes wide as the red trail snaked down her shoulders. The woman in red leaned closer, her perfume mixing with the sour scent of wine. She tilted her chin, daring the room to applaud. "What are you even doing here?" she mocked, her voice sharp, theatrical. "Events like this are for leaders, not seat fillers." The MC looked away, embarrassed but silent. A few men clinked glasses as if in agreement. Power is loudest when it is unchecked. And tonight, unchecked meant cruel. But silence, real silence, can be sharper than any retort. The black CEO set her glass gently on the table, wiped her temple with a folded napkin, and inhaled slowly. The room expected anger. They wanted a scene. Instead, they got control. A young journalist near the back tapped record on her phone, whispering to a colleague, "If this goes online, careers will end tonight." And for a fleeting moment, the golden ballroom felt less like a celebration and more like a trial, every gaze, every camera, every whisper, a jury waiting for the verdict. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to her. Her eyes, dark and steady, met the chandelier's glow. She had seen this scene before at 22, denied entry to a boardroom she chaired. At 29, mistaken for an assistant at a contract signing she orchestrated. Every insult had etched a scar of memory. Tonight was no different. The only difference was the audience. The woman in red twirled her empty glass, grinning like a victor. The crowd chuckled again, feeding on borrowed arrogance. But the black CEO didn't rise to the bait. She simply leaned into her phone one more time, voice low, calm, undeniable. "Cancel the $5 billion deal, effective immediately." The room didn't yet know what those words meant, but they would. The wine still dripped from her hair, streaking crimson down her white dress, like a signature written by someone else's arrogance. The laughter had not faded, it rolled in waves, bouncing off chandeliers and marble, feeding itself. Yet beneath the surface, cracks appeared. The server in the corner shifted nervously, tray clutched tight. His eyes darted from the humiliated woman to the red-dressed tormentor. He didn't laugh. He didn't move. He just watched, recording with his silence. The woman in red spun the empty glass in her hand, letting the last drop fall onto the floor. "See?" she shouted, her voice rising above the strings of the quartet. "Even dressed in white, some people will never belong at this table." Murmurs echoed. Some nodded. Others looked away, the kind of cowardice that thrives in velvet rooms. But then came the faint sound of a phone camera clicking open. A journalist near the back lifted her device just high enough. Not to be obvious, but not to be hidden either. She knew what she was capturing. The black CEO dabbed her sleeve with a napkin. No rush, no rage. The calm made the cruelty louder. She placed the napkin on the table, folded neatly, as if she had been waiting for this exact test. One guest leaned toward another, whispering, "Who is she?" The response came with a scoff. "Nobody. Look at her." But the server in the corner thought otherwise. He had seen the invitations. He had checked the guest list. He knew her name was printed near the top, embossed in gold. Yet he stayed quiet, waiting for the right moment. The woman in red wasn't finished. She yanked the microphone from the MC's trembling hand. Her laugh cracked through the ballroom like glass breaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've found tonight's entertainment. A seat filler who thinks she's someone." The crowd chuckled again, though weaker this time. The cruelty was beginning to taste bitter, even to those sipping champagne. The black CEO finally lifted her gaze from the table. Her eyes locked onto the microphone, then onto the woman holding it. But she didn't rise. Not yet. She reached instead for her phone, still resting by her plate. Calm, deliberate, audible only to the person on the other end. She spoke 3 words. Initiate the protocol. A ripple moved through her, invisible to most, but electric to anyone paying attention. The journalist did. The server did. A few guests near enough to hear the calm authority in her tone did. The woman in red smirked, mistaking stillness for surrender. "Do you see?" she asked the room. "She won't even defend herself, because she can't." But the truth was simpler. She didn't need to. The journalist whispered into her phone's mic. "Mark the time, this is where it shifts." And somewhere, far beyond the glittering chandeliers, the gears of consequence had already begun to turn. The ballroom's golden hum began to warp into something heavier, like static crawling across velvet. The woman in red gripped the microphone tighter, savoring her dominance. "Security!" she called, her voice sharp enough to slice through the quartet's melody. "Escort this guest out before she embarrasses herself further." Her words cracked like a whip. Heads turned. A few men in tailored suits straightened, expecting a scene. Some women leaned forward, phones hovering above clutches, ready to catch scandal for tomorrow's brunch gossip. The black CEO didn't move. She sat poised, her back straight, hands folded neatly over the napkin she had set down earlier. Her silence was a mirror, and the room couldn't stand its own reflection. "Do you hear me?" The woman in red sneered, pointing toward the table. "She doesn't belong here. This gala is for leaders, not charity cases dressed in white." A gasp escaped someone near the back. Not everyone found the cruelty amusing anymore. The journalist lowered her phone, shaking her head in disbelief. She whispered into the mic, "She said it. On record. Exactly like that." But it was the young server, the one still holding his tray like a shield, who cracked first. His voice, trembling but clear, broke through the haze. I saw her name," he blurted out. The room stilled. "She's on the list. Near the top." For a second, silence pressed against the chandeliers. Then laughter tried to smother it. The woman in red leaned forward, her tone dripping with venom. "Oh, how sweet. The waiter thinks he's an authority. Tell me, do you polish names as well as you polish glasses?" The server's cheeks burned, but he didn't back down. His voice steadied. "I checked the list myself. She was invited. She belongs here." The room shifted. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Some of the laughter faltered. A couple at the nearest table exchanged uneasy glances. The black CEO finally lifted her head. Her eyes met the server's, a brief nod of acknowledgement. Then she turned back to her tormentor, still calm, still anchored. Her voice, low but resonant, carried across the room. "Funny, isn't it? How the loudest voices are always the most afraid of silence." The line struck like a gavel. Phones rose higher. The journalist's eyes widened. She knew she'd just captured the sentence that would echo long after tonight. The woman in red tightened her grip on the mic. Her smirk faltered, then sharpened into a scowl. "Afraid?" she snapped. "No, darling. I'm the one in control here." But the truth was already slipping, spilling faster than the wine she had poured. And the black CEO hadn't even stood up yet. For the first time since the wine had spilled, she rose. The scrape of her chair against marble echoed louder than the quartet, louder than the chatter, louder than the shallow laughter that had clung to the air. The room fell into a hush, a silence thick enough to choke. The woman in red stiffened, microphone still clutched in her hand. Her smirk flickered, but she forced it back. "Oh? Finally ready to defend yourself?" she said, her tone laced with triumph, as though standing up was already a concession. But the black CEO didn't look at her. She didn't look at anyone in particular. She simply smoothed the fabric of her stained dress, white silk streaked with red, a flag of both dignity and insult. Then she began to walk slow, measured steps toward the stage. Each heel striking marble sounded like a verdict. Guests shifted uneasily. Phones tilted higher. The journalist whispered into her mic, "She's moving now. This is it." The MC, still shaken from being shoved aside earlier, tried to intercept, but she held up a hand. Not commanding, not pleading, just steady. And somehow, he froze mid-step. By the time she reached the edge of the stage, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. No longer a party, no longer a performance. The ballroom had become a courtroom, every witness waiting for testimony. She extended her hand toward the woman in red. "The microphone," she said. Calm. Inevitable. The woman in red laughed nervously. "Oh, darling, I don't think so. You've had your moment. Let's not make it worse for yourself." But her laugh rang hollow, tinny against the chandeliers. Guests felt it. They sensed the power wobbling. And then came the voice from the corner, the young server again. "Give it to her," he said, firmer this time. His tray shook, but his voice did not. A ripple of agreement moved through the room. A guest near the front nodded, murmuring, "Yes. Let her speak." Another chimed in, "She deserves it." Oh, the woman in red's hand tightened around the mic, her knuckles whitening. For the first time, she looked less like a queen and more like someone clinging to a crown about to be taken. The black CEO didn't move closer. She didn't threaten. She just waited, still as marble, her hand extended. Silence pressed harder. Eyes bored into the woman in red, waiting for her next move. And when the weight of the room became unbearable, the hand that had once poured wine finally trembled. With a forced smile, the woman in red placed the microphone in her palm. The transfer felt ceremonial, as if power itself had shifted form. The black CEO raised it slowly, her voice filling the room at last. "You mistook my silence for submission. That was your last mistake." The sentence sliced through the air like a blade. Applause didn't come yet, but the room no longer belonged to her rival. It belonged to her. The microphone hummed faintly in her hand, the sound system catching the silence before it caught her words. 1,000 eyes fixed on her. The chandelier light glimmered off the crimson stains on her white dress, turning them into emblems rather than shame. She didn't rush. She inhaled, slow and steady, letting the room strain against its own anticipation. Then, her voice calm, resonant, deliberate, broke the stillness. "This is not the first time someone told me I didn't belong." The sentence settled over the ballroom like smoke, seeping into every corner. Phones hovered higher. Even the string quartet, uncertain whether to continue, let their bows fall silent. Her gaze moved across the tables, not to the woman in red, but to the faces of the guests, the witnesses, the silent jury. At 22, I walked into a boardroom to present a strategy I had built from scratch. A man twice my age looked at me and asked whose assistant I was. At 29, I negotiated a deal worth $200 million, only to be mistaken for the caterer. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not laughter this time, discomfort. Recognition. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. And tonight, in this room of chandeliers and champagne, I was handed another reminder. No matter how much you build, no matter how high you climb, someone will always try to reduce you to nothing, to laugh, to spill their wine and call it entertainment. The woman in red shifted uneasily, the bravado draining from her smirk. The black CEO's voice grew sharper, but never louder. "You all witnessed it, and many of you laughed. But understand this, silence in the face of cruelty is complicity. You chose to watch. Some of you chose to cheer, and that is why nights like this matter." The journalist's phone shook in her hands as she whispered, "She's not just talking to them. She's talking to everyone watching this later." The black CEO lowered the mic slightly, just enough to let her next words slice through with precision. "I am not here to beg for space at your table. I am here to remind you why there is a table at all." The line hit like a gavel. Some gasped, some nodded. A few even clapped softly, unsure whether to break the tension. She let the silence stretch, commanding it like a conductor commands an orchestra. The stains on her dress no longer looked like humiliation, they looked like battle scars worn with intention. The woman in red muttered, "Dramatic," but her voice was barely audible, lost beneath the weight of the moment. And then, calmly, the black CEO concluded her opening with one final strike. Power doesn't ask permission, it doesn't beg for recognition, it simply stands, and tonight, so do I. The ballroom was no longer a party, it was a reckoning. The ballroom buzzed, no longer smooth with easy laughter, but jagged, uneven like glass underfoot. Her words had cracked something open, and everyone felt it. At one table, a woman in emerald silk stood and clapped twice, firm and unapologetic. The sound echoed against marble. "She's right," she said, voice cutting the tension. A few others joined her, hesitant but visible. Across the room, a man in a tuxedo sneered. "Oh, please, this is a gala, not a sermon." He raised his glass as if to reclaim the room. "We don't need lectures. We need leaders who don't play the victim." The remark drew a nervous chuckle from his table, but the laughter died quickly when the black CEO turned her gaze toward him. She didn't need to speak. The silence she offered was enough to hollow his bravado. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of how small his voice sounded against her presence. The woman in red, still near the stage, snatched the opportunity. "Exactly," she said, trying to rally the room. "You hear her? This isn't strength, it's theater. She's exploiting your guilt." But the journalist shook her head from the back, whispering into her phone's mic. "Correction, this is the sound of someone reclaiming a narrative that was stolen." The black CEO lifted the microphone again, her tone even. "Theater? No. This is accountability. You call it dramatic because truth always sounds louder in rooms that have tried so hard to stay quiet." A wave of murmurs swept the tables. Some guests avoided eye contact, staring into half-empty champagne flutes. Others leaned forward, drawn in, their expressions shifting from doubt to recognition. The young server, tray still trembling in his grip, spoke up once more. "She's not wrong." His voice was louder this time, steadier. "I've worked here long enough to see who gets treated like they matter and who doesn't." The crowd shifted again. A man at the back scoffed, "Stay in your place, boy." But before the sting could land, another guest, a silver-haired woman draped in pearls, stood. Her voice, worn but unwavering, carried across the hall. "No, he's right. We've all seen it. Too many times." A ripple of agreement followed, like dominoes falling. The balance was shifting, inch by inch, away from the woman in red. Her face tightened, the confidence slipping. "This is absurd," she hissed, gripping the edge of the podium. "You're all being manipulated by a story in a stained dress." The black CEO lowered her mic, tilting her head just enough for the words to land sharp. "Strange, isn't it? How fast your certainty dissolves when silence no longer obeys you." Phones lit up. Applause began again, tentative, then stronger. The gala wasn't united, but the fracture lines were clear. The reckoning was no longer hers alone. It had become theirs too. The woman in red's smile snapped, the mask too thin to hold under the weight of the shifting room. Her hand trembled around the stem of another glass of wine, not with nerves, but with fury. "You think a speech makes you powerful?" she spat, voice rising above the growing applause. "You're nothing but a charity project dressed up for display." The words landed hard, but they weren't enough for her. She stepped closer, her heels striking like hammers against marble. Then, with deliberate venom, she raised the glass and tilted it toward the black CEO's face again. The crowd gasped. A collective intake of breath thickened the air. Some shouted, "No!" Others froze, paralyzed by disbelief. The black CEO didn't flinch. She stood rooted, anchored, her gaze steady as stone. The wine never touched her. A hand shot forward the young server, abandoning his tray entirely, intercepting the glass midair. Crimson liquid splashed harmlessly across the floor, staining marble instead of silk. The room erupted with gasps, whispers, the sharp clatter of phones capturing every frame. The woman in red wheeled on him, eyes blazing. "How dare you?" she hissed. "You'll lose your job for this." But before he could respond, another voice rang out. The silver-haired guest in pearls. "Enough." Her word cracked through the hall like a whip. She stood taller than her years, eyes flashing. We all saw it. Twice. "This isn't a misunderstanding, it's an assault." The crowd shifted again. Murmurs swelled into outrage. Some guests booed. Others shouted. A man near the front barked, "Unacceptable." A younger woman with a phone yelled, "It's all on video every second." The woman in red raised her chin, desperate to reclaim her authority. "You don't understand who I am," she snapped. "I built this industry. This room exists because of me." But her voice no longer commanded the space. It cracked, brittle and frantic, against the rising tide of witnesses. The black CEO lifted the microphone slowly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "And yet," she said, each syllable sharp, deliberate, undeniable, "here you are, proving exactly why rooms like this were never built for people like me to enter. And exactly why I now build rooms of my own." The line detonated. Applause surged from half the hall, drowning out the sputtering protests of the woman in red. Guests rose from their chairs, some clapping, some filming, some simply staring in awe at the balance of power tilting before their eyes. The journalist whispered into her mic, breathless, "This is it. This is the turning point." The woman in red's face flushed crimson, a mirror of the wine dripping down the marble. She pointed, desperate, frantic. "Security! Remove her now!" But security didn't move. Not this time. Because the room was no longer laughing. The room was watching, judging, choosing, and in that silence, the scales had already tipped. The tension in the ballroom thickened, no longer fragile but electric like the hum before a storm breaks. The woman in red stood trembling with fury, her command for security echoing unanswered. The guards along the walls didn't move. Their eyes flicked toward the crowd, gauging the shifting tide. And in that hesitation, the black CEO acted. She lifted her phone, its screen glowing faintly in her hand. Calm, composed, she pressed one button and raised it to her ear. Her voice was low but carried, amplified by the microphone still in her other hand. "Nia," she said evenly, "activate the protocol." A pause, then a crisp voice crackled through the line, audible to those closest. "Confirmed. Systems engaged. Standing by for your word." Murmurs rippled. Guests exchanged puzzled glances. "Protocol?" one whispered. Another frowned. "Who's Nia?" Phones zoomed in, recording every flicker of expression. The woman in red scoffed, seizing the moment. "Oh, please," she sneered. "Talking to some assistant? What are you going to do, file a complaint? This is my world. These people answer to me." But the words landed flat, brittle against the rising curiosity in the room. The journalist scribbled furiously in her notepad. "She's not bluffing," she muttered. "Something's happening." The black CEO tilted her head slightly, eyes locked on her rival. "Funny," she replied softly into the mic. "You still think this room belongs to you?" She took one step forward, slow and deliberate. The crowd leaned in. Every movement, every breath, was now evidence in a silent trial. The silver-haired woman in pearls stood straighter, voice steady. "I think we're about to find out who truly holds this room." A hush followed, heavy and expectant. The black CEO lifted her phone again. "Nia," she said, each syllable measured, "begin verification. All accounts, all sponsorship contracts tied to this gala. Cross, reference with tonight's broadcast list. Timestamp everything." The voice on the other end responded without hesitation. "Understood. Verification running. Logs secured. Estimated completion in 6 minutes. 6 minutes." The words hung in the air, charged, like a countdown everyone could feel. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats. Some reached for their phones to confirm what they were hearing. Others simply stared, entranced, as if history itself had paused to watch. The woman in red's composure cracked. She clutched the edge of the podium, knuckles white. "This is nonsense," she hissed, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "You don't have the authority." The black CEO cut her off, her tone still calm, still steady, but sharp enough to slice through every doubt in the room. Authority isn't claimed by shouting, it's recognized when the room falls silent. And as if on cue, silence enveloped the ballroom. Not a glass clinked, not a whisper stirred. The only sound was the soft hum of chandeliers and the quiet tapping of phones capturing the moment. The reckoning had begun. 6 minutes never felt so long. The crowd buzzed in uneasy whispers, a mixture of fear, awe, and anticipation. The woman in red clung to the podium, her laugh brittle, desperate. "You're wasting everyone's time," she scoffed, voice pitching higher. "This act of yours? It'll fade. These people know who I am. They respect me. They fear me." But even as she spoke, the ballroom's energy betrayed her. Eyes no longer followed her. Phones no longer pointed at her. All attention had shifted, anchored on the woman in white, wine-stained but unshaken. The black CEO raised her phone once more. The voice on the other end was crisp, efficient. "Verification complete. All contracts logged. Broadcast list secured. Ready for confirmation." A murmur surged through the crowd. "Contracts?" someone whispered. "Broadcast list?" another echoed. The journalist's pen scratched furiously. "She isn't bluffing." The black CEO lifted the microphone, her posture unwavering. "For those still wondering who I am," she said, her tone even deliberate, "allow me to introduce myself properly." The chandelier light seemed to sharpen as she continued. "My name is Ava Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Global." Gasps erupted like thunder. The name hit the room like a tidal wave. Sinclair Global, the conglomerate behind half the sponsorships in the city, the silent power broker whose name was whispered in boardrooms but rarely seen on stage. The journalist's voice shook as she narrated into her phone. "She's not just a guest. She's the Ava Sinclair, the woman funding this entire event." The black CEO let the revelation settle before pressing further. "I am not here by accident. I am not here on borrowed invitation. This gala exists because I allowed it to. The lights above your heads, paid by my company. The wine in your glasses? Distributed by my networks. The contracts your firms rely on? Reviewed, signed, and sealed by me. The audience erupted again, but not in laughter this time, in astonished gasps, in thunderous applause, in shouts of disbelief. The woman in red's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, then shut again, words lost in the flood. Ava's voice cut through the chaos, sharp as steel. So when you poured your glass of wine on me, you weren't humiliating a guest. You were spitting on the very stage that feeds you. The journalist nearly dropped her phone. That's it. That's the quote. The silver-haired woman in pearls clasped her hands together and whispered, "Justice." The woman in red staggered back a step, eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit. But there was none. Every face was turned toward Ava. Every camera was locked on her. Ava took one final step forward, the microphone steady in her hand. "You mocked me in a room I built. You questioned my place in a gala I funded. Tonight, you reminded everyone why silence is mistaken for weakness. So let me be clear, this silence ends now." The ballroom erupted into applause, louder, sharper, unstoppable. Phones flashed. Guests rose to their feet. And for the first time that evening, the stage belonged entirely to her. The applause didn't fade, it swelled, rolling like thunder against the marble walls. For a moment, the gala no longer felt like a celebration, but like history being written in real time. The woman in red stumbled back from the podium, her face pale, her eyes wide. She shook her head, mouthing words that didn't quite form. No, this isn't possible." Her voice cracked. "She's lying. She has to be lying." But no one believed her. The journalist angled her phone higher, her voice trembling with exhilaration. "You're watching this live. Ava Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Global, just revealed she's the force behind this entire gala." Her feed flooded with comments, hearts, and shocked emojis. Guests who had laughed minutes earlier now rose to their feet, applauding with renewed fervor. A man in a navy suit clapped until his palms turned red, shouting, "This is leadership." A younger woman yelled from across the room, "We're with you, Ava!" The server, still trembling but emboldened by the shift, dropped his tray to the side and stood taller than he ever had in uniform. His voice rang out clear. "I told you she belonged here." The silver-haired woman in pearls clasped his arm, her eyes gleaming. "You spoke the truth when no one else dared," she said. The words, though soft, carried across the silence that followed the applause. The woman in red tried again, her desperation spilling out. "Don't you see? This is a performance. She can't prove it. She's just—" Ava raised her phone once more, cutting her off with quiet precision. The voice of her assistant carried crisply through the speaker. "Verification complete. All documents broadcast. Gala contracts tied to Sinclair Global now visible across partnered networks. Confirmation published." Gasps tore through the ballroom. Phones buzzed as notifications lit up screens. Guests stared down at their devices, reading the same words. Sinclair Global, official sponsor and owner. The woman in red froze, her denial collapsing into silence. Her power drained out of her like the spilled wine at her feet. One by one, the guests turned. Not to her, but to Ava. Their faces mirrored awe, respect, even guilt. The applause reignited, this time a standing ovation that rattled the chandeliers. The journalist spoke into her mic, nearly breathless. "The room has flipped. Every phone is recording. The woman who mocked her is finished." Ava stood steady, letting the waves of recognition crash around her. She didn't bask. She didn't gloat. She simply held the microphone as though she had been waiting all along for this silence, this verdict. The woman in red clutched the podium, her hands shaking. You can't do this to me," she whispered, but no one listened. No one defended her. She was already invisible, erased by her own arrogance. The server looked at Ava, his voice almost reverent. "What do you want us to do?" Ava's answer was calm, inevitable. "Watch. The reckoning isn't finished." And the room, once divided, now leaned entirely toward her, waiting for the final act. The ovation still thundered when Ava lifted her phone one last time. The crowd quieted, sensing what was about to happen. Every lens zoomed in, every breath hung suspended. Her voice was steady, deliberate. "Nia," she said, the microphone carrying her words to every corner of the ballroom. "Terminate the contract with Harrington Enterprises, effective immediately." The name struck the room like a lightning bolt. Harrington Enterprises, the empire built by the very woman in red, the company that had been flaunted as tonight's centerpiece sponsor. On the other end, Nia's tone was crisp, unshaken. Confirmed. Termination logged. Partnership revoked. All access revoked. Systems updated. Phones buzzed instantly. Guests glanced at their screens, emails, press alerts, breaking news notifications flooding in all at once. Sinclair Global withdraws Harrington sponsorship. Contract dissolved on record. Ownership shift confirmed. The woman in red staggered backward, her heels slipping slightly against the marble. No, no, you can't. Her voice cracked, frantic, like glass splintering. She reached out toward the crowd, desperate. You need me. My company built this industry. Without me, but the crowd didn't move toward her. They moved away. Chairs scraped as guests pulled back, leaving her isolated in the glare of the chandeliers. The journalist's voice carried from the back. Ladies and gentlemen, it's official. Harrington Enterprises is finished, and Ava Sinclair just ended it live. The young server, no longer trembling, stepped forward, his voice clear. You poured wine on her dress, but she just poured truth on your legacy. Laughter rippled, not cruel this time, but sharp, cathartic, the kind that stripped power bare. The woman in red shook her head violently, her lipstick smudging as she screamed, You can't erase me! Ava lowered the microphone, her gaze cutting through the noise. I don't erase, she said softly, but the silence made every word ring. I replace. Gasps erupted again, the line striking like a verdict no one could appeal. At the edge of the room, security finally stirred, not at Ava's command, not at the woman in red's, but by the current of inevitability sweeping the room. 2 guards stepped forward, their steps slow but certain. They didn't grab Ava. They didn't move toward her at all, their eyes fixed on the woman in red, her face drained of color. No, wait. But the crowd had already turned their backs. Phones rose higher, capturing her collapse. The stage, once hers, had shifted entirely, irreversibly. Ava stood unmoved, her dress still marked with wine, her poise unshaken. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room itself had carried out the sentence. The ballroom was unrecognizable. Minutes ago, it had been a theater for mockery. Now it was a tribunal, and the verdict was already written. The woman in red stood cornered, her empire dissolving in real time. The crowd's eyes no longer hers to command. Security lingered near her, waiting. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Every attempt at defiance curdled into silence, swallowed by the weight of what had just unfolded. Ava, still in her wine-stained dress, lifted the microphone for the final time. She didn't pace. She didn't shout. She stood rooted in calm authority, the kind that bends a room without raising its volume. You asked what I was doing here tonight, she began, her tone measured. You laughed. You poured your wine. You called it entertainment. You wanted me erased. Her eyes swept the room. No one looked away now. Not a single guest dared blink. But let me tell you what I was doing here. I was reminding every single one of you that power is not decided by who mocks the loudest, but by who stands the longest. Applause swelled, but she raised a hand, halting it. The silence that followed was heavier than any cheer. Power, she continued, doesn't come from humiliation. It doesn't need cruelty to prove itself. Power is quiet. It's the ability to walk into a room designed to break you and leave that same room standing taller than before. Oh, her voice steadied, each word cut clean. You mistook silence for weakness. You mistook dignity for fragility. Tonight, you learned the truth. Silence isn't submission. It's patience. The silver-haired woman whispered to the server beside her, tears glistening. This will be remembered. Ava's gaze lingered on the cameras, the journalists, the countless phones raised high. She spoke not just to the ballroom, but to everyone who would watch this moment beyond its walls. I don't need to prove myself on your stage, because this stage, like every contract, every light, every glass in your hands, was already mine. The words detonated like a final gavel. The room erupted applause, cheers, shouts of affirmation. Guests rose from their chairs, a standing ovation so fierce it rattled the chandeliers overhead. The woman in red slumped into a chair, her empire in ruins, drowned out by the tide she could no longer command. Ava lowered the microphone, letting the ovation crest. Then she offered the final line, soft but lethal, the kind of sentence that would echo long after the night was over. I don't need the clip you filmed, I am the ending you came to see. With that, she set the microphone on the podium, turned, and walked off stage. The ovation followed her. The reckoning was complete.